forward because you want to bring kids in early. You see these younger teenagers as valuable but an untapped audience, quoting from the emails, and suggesting teens are actually household influencers to bring their younger siblings into your platform, into Instagram. Now, how can you ensure that Instagram creators, your product, your program, does not facilitate illegal activities when you fail to remove content pertaining to the sale of minors? And it is happening once every 2 minutes in this country.
Senator, our tools for identifying that kind of content are industry leading. That doesn't mean we're perfect. There are definitely issues that we have, but we continue to invest in time.
Yes, there are a lot that is slipping through. It appears that you're trying to be the premier sex trafficking
Of course
site
not, Senator.
in this
Senator,
country.
that's ridiculous.
No, it
Senator,
is not ridiculous. You want to
we don't
turn
want
around
this,
and
we
tell
don't want
these
this
people
content on
that,
our platforms. And
why don't you take it down?
We do take
We
it down.
are here discussing,
We do
we
more
need
work to
you
take it
all
down
to
than-
work
than-
with
than-
us. No, you're not. You are not. And the problem is we've been working on this. Senator Welch is over there. We've been working on this stuff for a decade. You have an army of lawyers and lobbyists that have fought us on this every step of the way. You work with NetChoice, the Cato Institute, Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and Chamber of Progress to actually fight our bipartisan legislation to keep kids safe online. So are you going to stop funding these groups? Are you going to stop lobbying against this and come to the table and work with us? Yes or no?
Senator, we have a.
Yes or no?
Of course, we'll work with you on the legislation.
Okay, the door is open. We've got all these bills. You need to come to the table. Each and every one of you need to come to the table, and you need to work with us. Kids are dying.
Senator Welch?
I want to thank my.
That's ridiculous.
Robbie, please regale us with your radar today.
All right, Brianna. Well, there is no pastime more beloved by Congress than beating up on social media executives. And on Wednesday, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee engage in yet another round of fact-free histrionics as they thunderously denounced 4 tech CEOs, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, X's Linda Yaccarino, Snapchat's Evan Spiegel, and Discord's Jason Citron for a litany of allegedly unsafe business practices. Attending the committee meeting were the parents of several young people who tragically took their own lives after being scammed or bullied on social media. As such, the proceedings felt very much like a trial in which the CEOs, Zuckerberg in particular, stood accused of literal child murder. Now, many of the Senate's anti-tech crusaders and, frankly, main characters were present, including Republican Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Josh Hawley, and Democratic Senators Dick Durbin, Amy Klobuchar, and Richard Blumenthal. Senator Elizabeth Warren wasn't there, though she received several favorable shout-outs from the Republicans. Indeed, both sides of the political aisle were exceedingly pleased with themselves for acting in bipartisan fashion to wildly accuse 4 business leaders of complicity in despicable crimes against children. Now, if that sounds like an exaggeration, consider that Hawley prompted Zuckerberg to apologize to the families in the audience and then faulted him for refusing to pay them damages from his personal fortune. Have you compensated the victims? Hawley demanded. Take a look.
Senator, our job and what we take seriously is making sure that we build industry-leading tools to find harmful content, take it off the services,
To make money.
and to build tools that empower parents.
So you didn't take any action. You didn't take any action. You didn't fire anybody. You haven't compensated a single victim. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. There's families of victims here today. Have you apologized to the victims? Would you like to do so now? They're here. You're on national television. Would you like now to apologize to the victims who have been harmed by your product? Show them the pictures. Would you like to apologize for what you've done to these good people? You know, why, Mr. Zuckerberg, why should your company not be sued for this? Why is it that you can claim, you hide behind a liability shield, you can't be held accountable? Shouldn't you be held accountable personally? Will you take personal responsibility?
Senator, I think I've already answered this.
There are two big problems with the senator's approach: who they see as the villains here and what they see as the solutions. And I want to start with the first part before moving on to the second. So we have to scrutinize exactly the harms being alleged here. The purpose of this hearing was to explore social media platforms' efforts to combat child sexual abuse material, known as CSAM, and online exploitation more generally. Of course, all major social media platforms already prohibit CSAM and do in fact cooperate with law enforcement to identify and remove abusers, as they should. Zuckerberg patiently explained that Facebook has made millions of reports to law enforcement and to child advocacy organizations and uses AI tools to automatically detect and eliminate abuse. Quote, "We take down anything that we think is sexual abuse material," Zuckerberg said at the hearing.
That's why I
The social media platforms represented at the hearing all worked tirelessly to eliminate that vile content. Now, what critics are really alleging is that despite these efforts, some users of social media, including underage people, children and teenagers, still fall prey to pernicious behavior from sexual predators, scammers, and bullies. Take the example of Gavin Guffey, whose tragic death was referenced by Lindsey Graham in his opening remarks. At age 17, Guffey fell victim to a sextortion scheme. A con artist tricked Guffey into sending sexual images of himself on Instagram and then demanded compensation in exchange for keeping them private. Guffey tragically eventually killed himself. Now, this is an appalling crime and should be treated as such. In response, the victim's father, Brandon Guffey, a South Carolina state representative, sponsored legislation to strengthen the law as it applies to sexual blackmail of a minor. Predators who engage in fraud, blackmail, and sexual manipulation should absolutely be held accountable for their crimes. They should be brought to justice. But let's be clear here. The perpetrators of this crime is not Mark Zuckerberg or Linda Yaccarino or any other tech executive or Elon Musk if he'd been there. The perpetrator is the person who blackmailed Guffey. Anyone trying to move the accountability spotlight to the platform itself is engaging in blame shifting, I'm sorry to say, in service of an agenda that's pro-regulation and ultimately pro-censorship. More on that in a minute. Now, in other contexts, the fact that Facebook itself is not to blame would be obvious. In 2010, Rutgers University student Tyler Clementi killed himself, you might remember this story, after his roommate secretly reported him having sex with another male student. Now, this became a big national story, understandably, and the roommate, Darren Ravi, was prosecuted and convicted for invasion of privacy and some other offenses. But nobody thought the webcam company was at fault. And in fact, many Republicans intuitively understand this principle when it comes to other subjects. Indeed, the GOP generally takes the position that if one person shoots another person, the victim ought not to sue the gun manufacturer. In fact, gun industry enjoys major liability shields from exactly that thing. Guns don't kill people, people do. That's a common maxim of Second Amendment supporters. And in my view, they're right. I agree with them. But when it comes to social media, where the extent of the harm to young people is not in any way meaningfully settled, and in fact routinely exaggerated, many Republicans are marching in lockstep with their Democratic colleagues. At the hearing, Graham echoed the exact rhetoric of Democrats, accusing Zuckerberg and the others of having, quote, blood on your hands. Of course, Graham is far from the first political figure to make this claim. In July 2021, remember, President Joe Biden accused Zuckerberg of literally killing people because Facebook and Instagram had not done more to purge content that was critical of COVID mandates. That's the broader agenda of both the Democratic and Republican parties: greater government control over social media content. In order to obtain this control, senators from both parties have sponsored legislation to repeal or reform Section 230, the federal statute that protects internet companies from some liability. Now, Section 230 was a frequent punching bag at the Wednesday hearing. Quote, "For the past 30 years, Section 230 has largely remained unchanged, allowing big tech to grow into the most profitable industry in the history of capitalism without fear of liability for unsafe practices." That was a quote from Durbin at the hearing. That has to change, he said. Graham was even more explicit, calling on Congress to repeal Section 230 altogether. Now, in the past, former President Donald Trump, Biden, Warren, Klobuchar, Cruz, Hawley, and on, many other major political figures, they've all said similar things. But without Section 230, free speech on social media would be fundamentally threatened. It would be over. The reason the platforms permit users to post content at will is Section 230, which does establish that the content in question is the responsibility of the user rather than the platform. Think about it. If Facebook, Instagram, X were liable for all the content that appeared in their feeds, every post, every tweet, they'd have to vet it much more carefully. For one thing, this would dramatically increase the need for the platforms to engage in content moderation to protect themselves from libel lawsuits. Does Graham really want that? Does Donald Trump? On the contrary, complaining that social media companies engage in too much moderation is a standard conservative talking point. And there's merit to it. Again, I agree with them. As revealed by independent investigations like Matt Taibbi's Twitter files and my own Facebook files, those platforms censored contrarian content about elections and COVID-19 at the federal government's behest. Republicans were rightly outraged. Killing or even limiting Section 230 plays directly into the hands of the would-be censors. Suffice it to say that we should certainly have compassion for people who are victimized on social media, of course. And we should continue to explore methods of detoxifying the platforms, making them safer for kids. But the agenda of the Senate Judiciary Committee is not the protection of children. It's greater control over dissident speech. Don't fall for it.
I think that's exactly right. I broadly agree with your analogy, and certainly the implications of what would happen if people were liable for anything that was put on anybody's feed, which is why Section 230 is so important, and why threats over removing it should be paid very close attention to by all of those who are interested in being able to use these social media platforms, which have been so instrumental at various political moments, including the current one, to continue to be free.
For us, for the kind of content we produce. I mean, and we think it's value. We think alternative perspectives are important, and we rely on this infrastructure to do it.
Yeah, I remember we were in the tort class that I took in law school. We had this conversation about how the law is structured in a liability context, and whether or not you want to actually create higher liability standards for certain people in certain instances, and why would you do that, and where. And as we were talking it through, it emerged what the lesson that we were being taught Socratically was that there are circumstances where you want liability to attach to the person who has the most control in the situation to prevent the harm. In the scenario that you described with the college student who filmed their other fellow student having gay sex and then they committed suicide, the idea that the camera company, the streaming company would have any ability to discern the kind of content that was being recorded on their device and could do that in a way that didn't undermine the purpose and utility of the device itself, it's unfathomable. But if we're talking about, say, a rail line company that has control of its own tracks, it has control of having maintenance over the tracks, picking what kind of brakes are used in the train, all of those kinds of things, then we might say, well, I'm going to say there's a stricter liability standard for them, especially if they're hauling dangerous cargo, than a farmer whose tree might have fallen over the tracks and doesn't have it anywhere near the ability to monitor and keep the environment safe. And in this instance, it's just really hard to understand how anyone could imagine that in the instance of interpersonal bullying, the company has more of an ability to intervene when what we're really just saying is the kind of horrible things that people do to each other and have always done to each other in the world simply because they're happening on a social media platform needs to extend liability to folks that really aren't in a position of control here. It's very misguided, and I think you're completely right when you say it's just a proxy attack on free speech.
That's exactly that. The hearing was really remarkable. It wasn't just Holly. It was all of them were just thunderously angry at Zuckerberg and the others. And I understand the pain of the families. I can't even imagine that. It's so horrible. And I would absolutely want, again, the person directly responsible to face the harshest possible penalties. You want to talk about strengthening those penalties, having more penalties for swatting people, for using the internet for criminal activity. But it's because the underlying activity of that person is criminal. Yeah. And we can talk about dealing with that. But this is such a misdirected effort.
Yeah, and if it were that, Facebook had a policy that didn't allow folks who were, if someone's harassing you and you block them and they keep making new accounts and they're able to keep finding you and there's some technological intervention that's feasible, possible, maybe even exist, but Facebook doesn't implement it, that's a different kind of a question, right? Then it's in violation of its own policies. But this,
But if they because they have sloppy security and they leak your data or your location to someone who then kills you, or if they did get sued when they misrepresented how well video was doing on the platform. A lot of media organizations pivoted to video, and that was untrue, and they got sued and they had to pay out. So it's not that they can't be sued; it's that this is blame shifting.
right?
Again, as I said, in service of the broader agenda, which is the U.S. government wants more control over what we can say.
Yeah.
All right, we have Brianna's Radar up next. Stay tuned. More Rising in just a minute.
A wide ideological gap is emerging between young men and women across the globe. According to Gallup data, in the United States, UK, and Germany, women between the ages of 18 and 29 are heading in the liberal direction, and more men in the same age range are trending conservative. The divide is even starker in South Korea.
The United States shows a 30-point gap between liberal young women and conservative young men. In Germany, the gap is also 30 points and 25 percentage points. In the UK, the gap in South Korea is actually at 40 points. Now, do these numbers mean that young men and women are increasingly inhabiting separate spaces and cultures? So I saw this getting a lot of discussion on social media, and then I saw some pushback saying, someone was saying I tried to replicate this data and I couldn't, but it was apparently using a smaller data set. So obviously young people for a long time have been more liberal, and older as you get older, you get more conservative. But this just shows specifically a pretty vast gender gap. So even though all young people tend to be more liberal, there's this huge gap among that age cohort between men and women. And I'm seeing a lot of discussions of potential reasons for that. One being that when you have more, I guess, social conformity, you have more just people cohabiting in the same spaces, or more community-based people tend to agree. And when you allow, when you have more cosmopolitanism and more opportunities for women and for everyone, then there's more divergence in political ideology.
Are men not living in cities, and do women not live in rural areas? Aren't all communities basically 50-50 anyway?
Right. So the idea is, men always had those opportunities, but now that women have more, social, legal, financial independence, their attitudes have diverged from men to a greater degree.
So what is it about women's independence that makes them no longer want to be culturally conservative?
I don't know. That's what conservatives are asking themselves.
Might it be that it was political progressivism that enabled women to have some of those rights to begin with, like being able to own a credit card, which was a relatively new innovation in our legal system? Women weren't allowed to own their own credit cards until the 1970s in the women liberation movement. Is it possible that women see themselves as direct beneficiaries in terms of their ability to have freedom in progressive movements? And might it be that they see their ability to have control over their own reproductive choices as inextricably connected to progressive movements? I don't think that this is such a non-brainer, a no-brainer, or like a difficult question, rather the opposite of a no-brainer.
I don't think it's a difficult question. I think people are grappling with whether that will affect, lower their lower birth rates now in many of these countries, and men and women with vastly divergent political views, thus maybe failing to cohabitate, start families, have more kids if they have different values, that those problems are going to get, if you do think that is a problem.
I saw a little bit of this commentary where some women were opining that because women are allowed to make their own money, and have reproductive freedoms and are kept quite literally barefoot and pregnant, that men are now required to bring something different to the table, like likability, kindness, help around the house, generosity, joie de vivre, as opposed to simply just being able to exist with a checkbook, the way in years past women were compelled to get into unions because they had no other way to support themselves, and the children they inevitably had because of the lack of access to birth control. And if you read that backward, if you kind of like reverse engineer that, you can see why there are conservative movements that have always and continue to be opposed to free access to contraceptive care, who have a war against Planned Parenthood, which mostly provides reproductive health services that are mostly not having to do with abortion and the like, because I think there's a very strong understanding among conservative movements that freedom for women imperils their political project. But I don't think this should be doom and gloom for everybody. I think everyone should want to be a nice person, a good person, to bring value to a relationship outside of their ability to purely provide. And then if you want women and people generally to be invested in having families, you should make it less onerous for people to do so and create childcare incentives and make childcare less expensive, not do what the Republicans have just done, which is to end the child tax cuts that have child poverty during the pandemic, make education free, make healthcare free, the kind of things that really support a family, address the housing crisis where so few people can afford to live in a space that is conducive to raising a family. And on and on and on down the line. But I think we get to this place every time, unless you are part of a political movement that wants to force women to breed, which some of these kind of incel groups online, they do make those arguments, right? That it is unfair to men if women won't have sexual relationships with them, and there should be kind of sex quotas, and women should be forced to participate in all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's where that kind of a logic ends up taking you.
Okay, yeah, that's. I don't think I'm saying any of
I
that.
don't think you're saying that, but you know that's out there, Robbie.
Yeah, I also don't know whether this breakdown, men being more conservative. What's a specific policy? Policy? What is they just being asked? Is your ideology conservative? Like, I don't know that you could show me data if I admit I was wrong if that was the case. I don't know that young men out there trying to ban birth control or all those kinds of things. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I'm certainly not. I want access to contraception.
Well, the Friday Crew did a very popular segment recently, right, about the trad wife phenomenon, and that certainly does seem to be something online, at least, that is promoting a certain kind of lifestyle. Well, it is, but I think, I don't know what their takes were on that segment, but I think most leftists don't really care. Feminism means the choices to make, freedom to be able to make whatever choices they want to make.
Voluntary.
But the problem is that many of the most popular trad wife accounts online are women who don't disclose the fact that their husbands are some of the richest men in America. And the fantasy that they're promoting of standing in front of $400 cast iron cookware and beautiful outfits with their hair and makeup perfectly done and a bouncing baby on the hip is that they're able to hand that baby off to a child care provider and get their homemade bread and their homemade cheese.
Well, they're also, let's not pretend they're not income received. They're the ones you're talking about who have a lot of clout and a lot of social media presence. I mean, they're running a influencer business themselves.
That's true too. But the particular one I'm speaking of is, and it's a chicken and the egg situation. She's able to present and be successful and present so beautifully on Instagram, TikTok, whatever, in part because she has the resources to start a channel in the first place. I think most women with multiple children also have work obligations, don't have hours and hours a day to film and edit videos and buy the lighting equipment and camera equipment that's necessary to do so.
And if you're doing all those things, you're almost by definition not a trad wife. If you have vast
yes.
internet access.
Yes, and that's kind
Shouldn't
of
you
my
be out
point.
churning butter or something?
So are you convincing women?
But that's
like,
fine. People can do that. They can do whatever they want.
Sure, but are you convincing young women that is a legitimate kind of lifestyle choice, that the odds are in a country where the average salary is $50,000 a year, that they're going to go and meet some six-figure man? It's going to be way more than six figures, to be honest, but like some high six-figure earning man that is going to be enable them to stay at home in a beautiful house with beautiful lighting and beautiful cookware and all the childcare in the world and have a really ideal life. Because I think a lot of people would like that. A lot of women who see themselves as feminists and progressives, nobody wants to work, and most people are
That's not true.
parents.
Some people want to work, some people don't.
Yeah, I want to work.
Most people want to work at their passions and to do their dream, not slave away at some corporate job or, in some menial
People
position,
want different.
working some cash register somewhere. That people are not dreaming of labor. There's a whole TikTok trend that is also, I do not dream of labor. So to frame like it as feminists versus triwives, when it really is, I think socialists are all aiming for a world where we can spend time with our children and spend time in our home and make healthy meals and benefit our communities, because we're not forced into coercive employment environments where our labor is being extracted for some multimillionaire somewhere while we're getting a smaller piece of the pie, and our families and communities suffer. So I think that's very aligned with the progressive ideology.
You can still have all those things you're describing. You just have to live like outside a major city. There are places in the country where homes are extremely affordable and you can make it work on a one income salary, and you can take care of your kids and you can have that arrangement. That is absolutely possible. It's just not possible in New York or California.
That's unfortunately not true.
It's absolutely true.
This is a stat, remember, we talked about a lot during the Bernie campaign. I just Googled it to confirm it's still true. It is. In no state, county, or city in the U.S. can a full-time worker earning the local minimum wage come up with a cost for a 2-bedroom apartment. So
you have to earn more than the minimum
right,
wage.
And I hate to break it to you that many people struggle doing exactly that. That's the problem.
I didn't say it was possible for everyone. You have
that's the problem.
to work,
and
do a good job, earn the American dream, and it can be done.
Well, it used to be
Or
more the so-called American dream used to be more accessible, at least to people who were not legally discriminated against under the law, Black people in particular, and others, and women. But the American dream did used to be more accessible. That's why I constantly cite the statistic. American workers are having money stolen from them.
None of that's true.
Not only is wage theft the largest volume.
The average home size was smaller. People had fewer, households had fewer cars on average. They had a smaller TV. You're idealizing the past, and it's just nonsense.
I'm not idealizing the past. As I just mentioned, Black people lived in an apartheid state.
And
that's not idealized at all. But for white Americans, there were many benefits, including that the average wage ratio between workers and CEOs was so much smaller. American workers.
It doesn't matter if it. Yes.
Do you want me to? Can I just finish this point? Like I've been struggling with it for like 90 seconds. Americans used to take home a bigger part of their paycheck. And part of when social conservatives look back and say, well, women used to stay at home and we could have a whole family, and my dad was a mailman and we got by so well. And part of that is because workers got a bigger piece of the pie, bigger piece of their labor. So the average CEO used to earn 30 times more than what a worker made. Now they earn closer to 400 times what a worker made. So even though American productivity is up, Americans get to take home a smaller and smaller piece of the pie, with women joining the workforce, but also means that there's just fewer jobs to go around. But instead of changing the way that we structure our society and saying, okay, well, the two people are going to have to live with, if two people are the wage earners, they're going to both be able to pay for childcare, et cetera. What you have now is two people who are wage earners, and one entire salary has to go to childcare because nobody can actually live on the one salary anymore in the way they used to back in the 1960s. So, you can say, oh, well, people need to work harder.
No, I didn't say that. I said that's not true.
I'm sorry.
I
don't mean to mischaracterize you. What did you say?
You're romanticizing the past is an obvious economic fallacy. People had smaller homes on average, they had fewer cars on average, they had fewer material goods. You're right that inequality has risen, but I mean, this is a left-right difference. No, but for the right, that is not the point. For us, I don't care. Can I finish my point? Rich people can make, it's not about limiting their income growth. We don't care. As long as other people are better off too. You're better off relative to where you were in the 1950s. And yes, now we've unleashed capitalism. A lot of people are making a tremendous amount of money. It's not about arbitrarily reducing their success. It's about whether the gap can get bigger, but if the bottom line has gotten better, that's what we should care about.
Well, you are very protective of not reducing the success of millionaires and billionaires. They are very much interested in reducing the success of working people, and it's why they put millions of dollars behind legislation that consistently over decades undermines labor power, which is exactly how workers were able to earn so much more relative to their bosses back in the 1960s. So let them wage that war without any pushback if you'd like, but that's definitely a war that's being waged by the top 1% against the working people of this country.
We'll have more Rising right after this.
Oh. Well, so it's gonna be fit to the rest of the episode.
me just start out by making a point that too many people forget. And I insist that you never forget. 3 years ago, we had the lowest number of border crossings in decades. There's a reason why we had such a low number of border crossings 3 years ago. It's because we had a president who had implemented 4 very simple policies that led to that dramatic decrease in illegal border crossings. One is to end catch and release. Another is to implement Title 42. Another is to implement the Remain in Mexico policy. And the other is to build a border wall. And maybe you can add to that an attitude that if you want to come to the United States of America, come here legally, not illegally. And as soon as President Biden took office, he eliminated all of those policies that President Trump put in place and also issued basically an open invitation to anybody in the world that they can come here to the United States and cross our border illegally with no consequences. Now, the result was extraordinarily predictable, and that is this past year, we saw the highest number of illegal immigrants ever who were apprehended coming across our border. Well, Texas is stepping up, and we have done more than any state has ever done. And there's a reason for it. Texans, as well as our fellow Americans, they are furious about the lawlessness caused by President Biden's open border policies. And they should be angry about that. And it's because of that I declared border security to be an emergency item this session for us to not only address, but to address quickly because of the need for us to be even more proactive to deal with the border. There are several reasons why we need to be more proactive. The upcoming elimination of Title 42 is going to be bringing even more people across our border. It is expected to expire in May. According to federal estimates themselves, they said that once Title 42 is eliminated, we can expect up to 18,000 people crossing the border a day. Calculate that, and that would be more than 6 million people crossing the border a year because of the elimination of this one last bar to people coming across the border. The magnet will just continue to increase. And we're seeing that occur as we speak. In January, the numbers are always about the number of people coming across the border. We've already seen upticks in what has happened from January to February. And we have information about people who are in Central America right now making their way toward the border. And we are working on strategies to make sure that Texas is going to be prepared. To the extent that any of this information is beyond our borders, we're sending a message today. And that is, if you're coming toward the United States of America and you are thinking about crossing our border, and you're thinking about making your border crossing in the state of Texas, you're picking the wrong state to enter into or to try to enter into. Because we're going to do everything we can to keep you out of our country. But I want to give you an example of how the increase has occurred in just the time period since right before Biden took office till today. In February of 2020, in the 1 week, February the 12th of 2020, in the entire border, there were 3,985 people apprehended. It's that entire border, the Texas border. 3,000, so just under 4,000 people apprehended coming across the Texas border in February of 20, which was the last February that President Trump was in office. The first February that Biden was in office, it went from 3,985 to 13,672 in just 1 week in February, that very same week. And then the year after that, that very same week, it jumped to 21,560. And so it went up about five times in just that 1 point period, year after year, because the price is up on border policies. Well, what Texas has done is we have deployed the Texas National Guard far more than anything ever in the history of the United States of America to repel and to turn back people who are trying to cross the border illegally. We have deployed the Texas Department of Public Safety, and they have arrested more than 25,000 criminals who got past.
En plus de sa technologie intuitive, le Mustang Mach-E offre beaucoup d'espace.
Chérie, on s'occupe du souper ce soir.
Un coffre à l'arrière et un autre à l'avant.
Farmer protests continue to roll throughout Europe. Now, Ireland and England have joined the fight. Those farmers, though, are no longer in the European Union. So, what do they want? How can they express solidarity with European farmers also protesting their own plights? Biochemical engineer and corporate complex problem-solving expert Ivor Cummings joins us on this issue. He's been raising a lot of awareness about the regulations that are hurting working class people in Ireland and abroad. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Great to be back.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about what has happened to Irish farmers, not just this weekend or through the protests, but for months on months coming, why it's so hard for them and why they may feel solidarity with European Union farmers?
Yeah, so the war on farming, last year I did a video, The War on Farming, when these protests broke out in Europe, and I gave some thoughts on it. So I've been watching it for many years. So many years ago, they used to give farmers money, basically from Europe, to get them to produce less of X or Y, etc. It seemed a little bit wrong because it wasn't market forces, which I like, and it was tops-down, autocratic, kind of centralized government from Europe, so I didn't like that, but it was fairly benign. But now, of the last couple of years, especially since March 2020, it's massive escalation. They're going after the farmers across the world. It's quite apparent. And they're using, of course, the classic kind of canard climate. So I believe in Europe, they're using, particularly in the Netherlands, nitrogen. They've chosen nitrogen as their kind of distraction. And then they're using CO2 elsewhere, and they're using climate targets, and all of this kind of stuff. But it seems from the top, there's a relatively sudden interest in crushing farmers and in minimizing the production of real food locally and for local communities. So it seems very much, and I would guess, and it's almost certain, it's been identified now that as well as CBDCs for more control, COVID for vaccine passports and QR codes and all the other things we're well aware of. Farming is seen as something to actually begin to minimize, and it's basically just helping them on a road to a more kind of 15-minute city type setup, which would be delightful. So let's move the masses into cities and departments, let's have them tracked and traced, and let's feed them a pipeline of ultra-processed food from all our corporate buddies. And clearly, having lots of farmers locally producing real food, not processed junk, that doesn't really work with that agenda. So I think any listener can realize, that's the connection. Because of course, if you're promoting one thing, if you're smart, you almost got to make sure you de-promote and remove the other options. And that's what we're seeing.
Right, so last year, the Irish government announced that they would cull, which means slaughter, 200,000 dairy cows over the next 3 years. On what data? Why? Why would they do this?
As always, built on nonsense. But they've got the nonsense written down, and it's got tags to the IPCC or the climate change kind of panel in the UN. So it looks kind of official. But I've interviewed several professors of climate science and atmospheric science already, and I'll be interviewing more. And they go through the actual data, and it's not there. So to give a quick example, one person, Coonan, Professor Coonan, made a great point, and he's a Caltech provost. So he was Obama's kind of scientific advisor. This is top of the heap. And he made the point that in the last century or so, the climate has moved up. You can argue about why, probably a natural cycle. It's moved up around 1.3, 1.4 degrees, let's say. And in that period, the planet has boomed. We've moved 90% reduced poverty. Our climate-related mortality and deaths has gone down around 90%. The GDP per capita across the world has gone up by a factor, I think 7. That's my memory. And I could go on all day. So we've gone up 1.3 degrees and everything has got massively better, hugely better. And now we're saying 0.5 or 0.6 or whatever number you want to guess at in the next 50 years is going to suddenly make everything bad. It's palpably absurd. But yes, I think they're using that simply as an excuse to do or to achieve the strategies that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So the cull of cows was fact-checked. I'll have to tell you now, it was fact-checked by Reuters or someone. And they said the Irish government did not stipulate that they have to remove 200,000 cows. They proposed potentially. So you know the way the fact-check uses a kind of a fact element to actually discredit, but they pushed it. And our Minister for Climate and Energy, can you imagine having a Minister for Climate and Energy, two opposing things? He is an absolute idiot, and I can say this safely because I've been watching him for years. There is no way on this earth that a person like him, of obviously compromised intelligence, could get into a ministerial position when this party is 2 or 3% of the country's vote. The reason he got there is the reason a lot of them have got there over 20 years. Doors are open for certain useful idiots, and doors are closed against family people and stand-up people who want a national, sovereign, healthy nation. So over 20, 30 years, we end up with doofuses like this at the top, and they literally have a hand up their bottom. So he's the one coming out with his nonsense about 200,000 cows.
I don't know what idiot would say, oh, I love the planet so much, I want to kill some animals to help the planet. I don't understand that. Who buys off on that? Who is that stupid? Another thing that kills me is this idea of, yes, the planet has warmed, but we, once we get to a certain threshold, cannot stop it. And that's something Klaus Schwab has said, is that it will we'll never be able to go back. When we have proof that the Romans had an era of global warming, what did they do? Did they have a Paris Climate Accord? We should look into that, right? It's so stupid. I guess what I'd like to ask you as an Irish person is, what do you think what is it specifically that Ireland can do different? And does this actually help the European farmers that there is solidarity throughout, at least throughout the continent?
Before I had my account, I obviously was lying awake at night thinking the tax man is going to come and knock on the door and even like get me out of bed and be like, do all this. I mean, he obviously wouldn't, because I'm like a drop in the ocean to him. But if I didn't have my accountant, I just would not have a clue. The business would not exist.
Sage gives accountants and bookkeepers tools and insights to help clients like Kate manage their business. Sage, helping business flow.
Yeah, Natalie. Well, solidarity always helps. And I've said since early on in COVID, the only thing that can help with this dystopian nonsense, that, by the way, people should be well aware, this is all coming from a nucleus of largely wealthy, super wealthy, older Caucasian men. And they have women as well in there. But that's where it's all coming from. All the accusations of racism and all the other stuff we've gone through with the mass migration, it's all coming from wealthy Caucasian people. So people should keep that in mind. But your question was, what can we do? And the only thing is grassroots. The only thing are the farmers, the welders, the builders, the common sense people of the land recognizing that this is a coup. And the coup was set in motion in the 50s with Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They identified pandemics and climate disaster as very useful opportunities. In the 50s, they identified them with no scientists in the room. And 70 years of funding and growing the UN, growing the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, I can go on all day. They have, through a corporate, strategic, very well run, corporate thing, no conspiracy theory, they have managed to get all the right people in place, the right organizations. And the only thing that can push back against that now is exactly what you mentioned, protests and people coming together at grassroots level. And the reason is that, unfortunately, Ireland's politicians clearly and evidently, there is no question about this, now set our policies based on UN, EU, and kind of WEF, or Bilderberg, objectives. And that's why they've fallen completely out of touch with the people, because they get voted by the people with some smart talk about what they do for them. And when they get in, they immediately answer to the powers that be. So that's what we see. And recently, we had a 76%, I think, said we have had too much uncontrolled immigration. And the government are still ramming it home. But why would they, when 76% of ordinary people in a top poll system, completely representative, are saying no? Why would the government keep ramming it in? And the answer is quite simple and self-evident. Because they're answering to someone who wants it. And that's it.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to bring our audience awareness of this 15-minute piece that you did about 4 months ago in response to an Irish documentary, which was the craziest, most dystopian thing I've ever seen in my life, but it was real. I'd like to play a little clip of it, but can you set it up? Tell us what this is, the fact that it was actually on TV, and how you almost fell out of your couch just with shock that they were saying all the quiet parts out loud.
Yeah, it was comical. I made the comment before we went on air that, and I said it in video, if I wanted to make a parody video to lampoon and to make it entry, would do fine. I would not need to change it. It was self-parody. It was absurd. But essentially it was Ireland 2050. And in 2050, Ireland is going to have major cities moved inland. And they said that. They had panel interviews and discussions set in 2050. So it was like a mockumentary. And they were talking about how Curracloe, an Irish beach where it's nearly always raining, even in summer, which gets some good days. In 30 years, that will always be raining in the summer, but you'll get some good days. There's no question about that. In 30 years, Curracloe will be the exact same as it is now. But they said it's now Costa del Curracloe.
Okay.
I mean, it was just nuts. And then in the middle of it, as I watched it, I could not believe it. They had farmers who had no longer made milk because they said in 2050, back in 2030, they brought in a fake milk that was just as good as the real thing and it cost half the price. So we had to give up making milk. But sure, it's for the best. Some old actor playing a farmer. But then they brought the daughter in who was an engineer. And she looked like she needed to engineer her diet, to be quite honest. And the daughter, in fact, all the actors were dreadfully unhealthy looking. But anyway, and she goes into a barn and the door opens automatically. And what are they doing in the barn? That she switched over her father's whole farm